As usual, I want to begin with 2 or 3 shorter, smaller items before getting to the central topic for this evening. And as I know from your emails and other communications, you will want me to talk, both those of you here in the United States and those of you abroad, about the remarkable events of the last week, particularly in Washington, D.C., but really across the entire country. The United States is at a crossroads that have been building to this point for quite a while, and I will try to explain how that looks, at least from this perspective, in the hopes it will add something to your own thinking and reflecting about what it all means. So let me begin with a remarkable event that happened a couple of weeks ago, when the crescendo of building up under the effort by President Trump and his associates to undo the election results, to claim that they were fraudulent, and to replace them with a victory of himself rather than the victory of Joseph Biden and Kamala Harris. As the legal effort to overturn the election petered out, 50 to 60 efforts before judges, all of which the government lost, even when the judges were those appointed by the Trump administration, it became necessary for other parts of the ruling groups in this country to weigh in. And one of the most interesting that I want to talk to you about was a public statement made by all living former secretaries of defense. For those of you not familiar, in the United States, what other countries in the past have called the Department of War, we don't call that. We call it the Department of Defense, so that the public relations of the war machine can, right from the beginning and the name, carry the implications that we are, of course, always purely and merely defending ourselves. And the fact that we have more bases in the rest of the world than all other countries combined, it's not even close, is carefully avoided so we don't have to confront the obvious contradictions. There were 10 of these former secretaries of defense, Republican, some Democrat, and they all got together in order to undermine any movement in the direction of using the military here in the United States to weigh in on one side or another of this dispute. That is, the dispute between the Democrats who won the election and the Republicans who want to contest the Democrats' winning of the election. And the secretaries of the defense all agree that the military should not be involved. And I want to read to you the key sentence. This is a quotation, there's no role for the U.S. military in determining the outcome of a U.S. election. And indeed, it was an important intervention because one of the former military advisors to the president had urged him to declare martial law, which would entail, as he put it, bringing the military in to invalidate the election in certain states and to hold new elections in those states, presumably defending with the military these actions, which would be extraordinary in American history. Okay, here's my comment. What this really means is that the military do not want to participate in a struggle between the Republicans and the Democrats. But that is not the same as saying that the military won't interfere and shape elections. The military in the United States always interferes all the time in the elections. And it's important that everyone understand how that works. To explain it, many of us quote President Eisenhower, a Republican, shortly after World War II, who, upon leaving the presidency when his term was over, warned the American people about the military-industrial complex. And remember, he was the leading general of the American military before he became president. What Eisenhower meant, and he explained it, was that a very dangerous, in his view, relationship had developed between the military on the one hand and the huge capitalist corporations that produced military equipment, munitions, bombs, planes, missiles, all of that. The government was the sole customer for all of these companies. The government was therefore the source of the profits of these large companies. It was incumbent upon the companies, if they were to be profitable, to have a good relationship with the government. And so, Eisenhower warned us, a very cozy mutual support arrangement could be enacted by these two, but of course it would require a virtually limitless provision of money. Money would have to go to the government, which it could then use to purchase military equipment, and that would make a very cozy arrangement. And the fear of the president was that the profits of the businesses and the benefits to the leading government military officials on the table and under the table would lead to decisions being made that might be good for those companies and might be good for those generals and government officials, many of whom, if you've noticed, come from those companies where they are high executives and then become government officials and then go back to those same industries, that we could have a situation where decisions were made good for them, but not necessary for the defense, not necessary for the military, and an enormous cost in taxpayer payments to keep the cozy relationship going. President Eisenhower warned us, and my judgment is that every president since that has carefully and systematically avoided paying the slightest attention to this issue. That is why, for example, the American military today typically, not every year, but often, asks for an amount of money from the budget that is in fact given to them or exceeded by the Congress. That's right, the Congress allocates more to the military than the military even asks for. That is a cozy relationship indeed. It also helps to explain why the United States spends on its military this year roughly $750 billion, more than the next 5 or 6 or 7 countries in the world together spend on the military, and that includes Russia, China, and other countries. So we are an enormously military dependent. The military has its installations across the country in many states. The companies producing goods for the military are scattered across the country in many, many states. If you put together where the military are and where the provisioners, the capitalist provisioners of the military are, then there's barely a place in the United States that doesn't have a constituency of businesses and workers dependent on either the government as the military spender or the corporations who get the bulk of the money from the government. And therefore it is made crystal clear to every congressman or woman, to every senator, that were you to vote against the military, there's an immediate group of people in your state, in your congressional district, who will be upset, who will be angry, who will prefer an alternative candidate to you if the alternative candidate promises to do what the military need and want. If you look at votes on the military budget, including the most recent one a few weeks ago, you will see overwhelming support. There is no basic disagreement between the establishments of the Republican and Democratic Party on supporting the military. And that is done out of fear of what might happen to your political career if you did not do that. Nobody has to threaten you. There needs to be no conspiracy. The thing is arranged structurally. And that's why the military, there is no real debate. Everyone was shocked when President Trump refused to go along, as most presidents do, but he made it crystal clear that he had no problem with the money for the military. He wanted to piggyback some other kinds of concerns he had, stick them into the bill about the military, and get them when he couldn't get them any other way. That was what he vetoed it, refused to sign it for, and the Congress dutifully met, overrode his veto, and passed the bill, and that reproduces it. But the notion that the military doesn't shape our elections is nonsense. These 10 people are writing because they would like you to believe that because they don't care whether Republicans or Democrats get in, because it has never mattered to them, that therefore they don't intrude on our politics. That's simply not true, never was true. President Eisenhower was quite right, and the fact that subsequent presidents don't pay much attention doesn't invalidate one iota of what President Eisenhower said. I want to turn next to advertising. It's a topic that many of you have asked me to speak about, that is a very important part of our economy, our capitalist economy. There's really nothing like an advertising industry in feudalism or slavery or any other economic system. It is very much a product of capitalism, and I want to explain that and then talk about what the implications are, since I think it may surprise many of you. So let's begin. Advertising has a simple function. You all know what it is because we are literally drowning in advertising, specifically here in the United States, which has been a pioneer in the ways in which you can suffocate a population with advertising. The purpose of advertising is simple: to sell something. End of story. Advertisers try in every way that they know how to get you to buy whatever it is that's paying them to do the advertising. Whatever commodity, whatever company is producing that commodity, it's the company that produces the commodity that pays the advertiser to get you to buy it. Why are capitalists concerned with this? And the answer is very much about the capitalist system. Capitalists are caught in a terrible contradiction of their system. Can be easily explained. Every capitalist is always looking for ways to economize on labor costs. That's how it's put in the university. Here's what it means. If you can find a cheaper worker, hire him or her rather than a more expensive worker. If you can get an immigrant, you can pay them less, use them. If women get paid less than men, go for them. If you're allowed to hire children, go for them. Go for wherever you pay the least for the labor you require. If none of those options are available, replace worker with a machine that does the same but costs less. And in all those examples, and I could increase that, moving from the United States to China or anywhere else can be motivated by saving on labor costs, because you can pay a Chinese worker or a Brazilian worker or an Indian worker less than you would otherwise have to pay. So capitalists are forever looking to economize on labor costs. Now here comes the contradiction. The more successful capitalists are in giving less money to workers because you've replaced them with a machine or you've replaced them with a cheaper worker, the less purchasing power workers as a whole have. And the harder, therefore, it is for you to sell your product. Poor capitalist, the more successful you are in spending less on your workers, the less they have to buy what you've produced. the extra you've made by economizing on labor is then lost by your inability to sell all that you have produced. Unless, of course, you can boost the sales somehow. And here's where the advertiser arrives. The advertiser says, hey, you're only selling X amount of whatever you produce. You could sell more than that, but in order to do that, you have to cultivate in the people, in the market, among the consumers, a desire for what you produce. If there's already desire, a bigger desire, a more intense desire. Let us go out there and cover the billboards and put the ads on television and in every other way grab the attention of the consumer and direct that attention to your product. We will say wonderful things about your product. Some of them will even be true. And we will get more purchases so you don't have the bad luck of having saved on labor only to discover you can't sell. So in come the advertisers. But of course, they don't do this work, putting up the signs, inventing the arguments, making up the virtues of your product if it doesn't have any or if it doesn't have enough. They don't do that for free. It's a business like everything else in capitalism. And the producer of goods and services that are advertised has to pay the advertiser. And now here again is a problem, because if the capitalist has to pay the advertiser, then that's profit he's not getting. So again, he can boost his profit by paying workers less, but he'll hurt his profit if he can't sell, but he'll also hurt his profit if he pays an advertiser to be able to sell. So what have capitalists done in this contradiction? Here's how they've resolved it. Number one, they raise the price of the commodity they're selling and use the extra money they get having raised the price to pay the advertiser. Now, what that means is, and here's the message I would like to get clear in everyone's mind. What this means is that when you buy an advertised product, and it's hard to buy anything else, when you buy an advertised product, you pay a price that doesn't just cover what it costs to produce that product. You're also paying a price higher than that, so the producer can recover by charging you more what that producer had to pay to the advertising agency that persuaded you to buy it. Now, let me say that in simple English. In capitalism, you pay the cost of persuading you to buy it. You're required to pay for the advertising trying to get you hoodwinked into buying the thing. It's bad enough that the thing is advertised, but that you have to pay for the advertising, I hope you know that. And there are many products where the price would be a small fraction of what it is today if all it had to do was cover the costs and a reasonable profit on those costs of producing. The price is much higher because the most amount of money that that capitalist who makes that thing spends is for the advertising to get you to buy it. Best example, many over-the-counter medicines. Another example, soda pop, the drink. The cost of making that sweet, bubbly water is tiny. The amount spent on advertising so that you buy it is enormous. And when you buy it, you're paying for the advertising to get you to buy it. The next time someone tells you capitalism is efficient, remember this. This isn't efficiency, this is lunacy. It's irrational. But it's even worse than that. Because advertising is now everywhere. You can't go down the street You can't turn on your radio or television. You can't do anything in this society without being literally bombarded by advertising. And advertising is a particular way of communicating. If you were brought up in a reasonable family and went to reasonable schools, etc., you know that most things have good and bad sides to them. People, institutions have strengths and weaknesses. And you've learned over the years that to make good judgments about things, you should be able to identify and weigh the good sides and the bad sides and then make your decision. Advertising is not interested in good sides and bad sides. It's a kind of communication that has nothing to do with bad sides. The advertiser only tells you what's good about whatever it is he or she is trying to sell. Your hope is that what they tell you is true. But every day there are cases in our courts of advertisers who've made things up, who've hidden realities from us. You know, the cigarette companies that didn't tell us about the lung cancer, the automobile companies that didn't tell us over the last 10 years that they were faking the pollution devices and controls that were supposed to clean our air. No, advertising is a lopsided, dishonest discourse. It doesn't evaluate goods and bad, strengths and weaknesses. In fact, it teaches us by endless repetition that we should be hyped up on one side or the other. Something is either all good, that's what the advertiser tells us who was hired to tell us that, or who tells us that the other product of somebody else that's not paying him is all bad. Don't buy this, buy that. This is good, that's bad. You know, it lops over into our politics, where our competing politicians put out ads about how they're all wonderful and their opponent is all bad. This way of thinking is childish at best and socially destructive at worst. Advertising teaches everyone to think and talk in this lopsided, one-sided, dishonest, fundamentally dishonest way. Okay, I want to turn now, because time is always an issue in these evenings, I want to turn now to what happened here in the United States. It's really what I want to talk about. What happened over the 4 years, 2016 to 2020, of this remarkable administration by Donald Trump, who was as surprised by his victory in 2016 as everybody else was. What is it about? What does it mean? What are the implications, both for the United States and the rest of the world? Okay, I want to begin with a little bit of history, since that sets the context and I believe helps us understand what happened, including the assault on the Capitol building of January 6th, and where we're going as a consequence of those events. The United States had a peculiar economic history, both in the 19th century and in the 20th century, that help explain Donald Trump. Perhaps the most profound reality of American capitalism in the 19th and 20th century was that it was remarkably successful. It turns out in retrospect that fighting a violent revolutionary war against the United Kingdom, the British, the Revolution of 1774, 5, 6, and so on. This revolutionary war breaking the United States away from the British Empire, an act of fundamental anti-colonialism violently pursued, a war, freed up the United States to have a kind of explosive period of economic growth. There were a number of components of this growth. I don't have the time here to go into them, but I want to mention 2 or 3. Number one, it required ethnic cleansing, the destruction of the native population, which was the project of the 19th century. It began earlier, but it was completed in the 19th century from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. Number two, it depended on finding a commodity here in the United States, particularly important in its early years, that could be sold in the rest of the world at a good price to generate the funds that could build an economy on the land cleared of the Native Americans. And that commodity was, and only was, cotton. It turns out that the soil and the temperature and the water in the American South was the appropriate one for cotton cultivation. It turned out to be key because the most successful industry in Britain and the rest of the world in the 19th century, particularly the early parts of it, were textile, cotton textiles. And you can't produce cotton cloth without the cotton. And cotton could be grown in the American South. The soil was good, the water was good, the market was there, everything, but one thing was lacking: labor. It's a labor-intensive activity. The Native Americans wouldn't do it, and they were being decimated anyway. And there weren't enough European settlers willing and able to do the work. And you all know what the solution was: bringing African slaves in huge numbers to do the work of producing the cotton which made American capitalism have enough money at its early decades to experience explosive growth thereafter. By the middle of the century, you didn't need the slavery anymore, and the Civil War ended it. It destroyed the slave economy, destroyed the slave owner by taking away from the slave owner the slave, a major part of the slave owner's property, for which the compensation was nothing. It was the expropriation of the private property of the slave owner. That's how capitalism got its second big boost in the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. It meant that for the 19th century, capitalism was so successful in the United States that when workers got together, as they did, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, demanding better wages and better working conditions, they had to fight hard, bitter battles, but in the end, they got a rising wage because capitalists were rich enough, profitable enough, that was an easier solution than continuing to fight when the employers, after all, are a small number and the employees are a large one. So the following sentence is true, and here we get to the nub of it. Real wages rose for the American working class across the 19th century and into the 20th century. Every decade, the real wage, and by that I mean what you could buy with your wages. So it adjusts the money you get for the prices you have to pay for the goods and services you consume. That went up every decade for 150 years, roughly 1820 to 1970. Amazing. If you have rising wages for 150 years, you develop in your people a peculiar mentality. They begin to think that they live in a charmed place. If they're religious, they think God really prefers or favors the United States because, look, working people are doing better each decade than they did the decade before. It develops in people a sense that it's built into their society, that each generation will live at a higher standard of living than the generation before. Your kids will have an easier time than you did, and your grandkids easier still. You can call it the American dream. You can call it the capitalist system. Lots of words for it, but it's this feeling that you as an American citizen are somehow entitled. You should play by the rules, work hard, go to school, but you will then get the material prize. It's somehow the nature of the society. And that idea settled deep into the American consciousness. It's important to get that in your mind because that's what's been taken away from a large number of Americans and made them very, very angry. And you saw that on January 6th. But let's get back to our story. The first time this lovely picture of rising everything was really challenged was in the great crash of 1929. You had already had a century of rising wages when this hit. But boy, it hit. And suddenly, whoa, a job wasn't secure, a future wasn't secure. You couldn't tell the American people that everything was rosy anymore. Those of you may remember reading books like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. That was the reality for tens of millions of Americans. And they became, understandably, bitter, angry, determined. What was wrong? What had been told to them that wasn't working out? What was this American dream that was disappearing before them? And in their shock and in their anger, they decided to listen in huge numbers to people who said the problem was capitalism. The system we have in which a few people are the owners, the boards of directors, the major shareholders of most of our businesses. And the vast majority of us are employees. That little minority, they're the employer. That's how our system works. And the employers give us a job or they don't. Pay us a living wage or they don't. They decide based on what's best for them. And if they decide that they're best off cutting back on jobs, we're out of a job. And if they need to save on spending on labor, our incomes collapse. Oh boy. And the American working class in the 1930s took a response that was remarkable. They joined unions on a scale that workers had never done in America before and have never done it since. These were people who had never been in a union, whose parents had never been in a union, but who understood that to fight the way this system works, they needed the power of workers to counter the power of the employer. Not only did they join unions, but they joined two socialist parties and a communist party that became very strong in the Depression of the 1930s. In short, the American working class went sharply to the left. And boy, did that get them results. Wow. They got Social Security. Never existed in America before. If you're 65 years of age or older, you've had a lifetime of working, you now want to retire, the government will give you a check every month for the rest of your life, no matter how long you live. The first unemployment compensation at the federal level. You lose your job through no fault of your own, the government will give you for a year or more a weekly check to help you out. For the first time in America in the 1930s, a minimum wage law was passed, preventing any employer from paying workers too little to live decently. And finally, a federal jobs program that hired 10 to 15 million Americans who were unemployed at the time and who thereby felt much better about themselves, had a job, earned an income, could pay their rent, didn't have to be evicted. You know. The suffering of the Great Depression made the movement from below that went to the president, a middle-of-the-road Democrat. You might compare and say to, I don't know, Joe Biden. And they said to Franklin Roosevelt, you better help the mass of people that are being screwed by capitalism, or else we're not going to vote for you and you won't be president. You won't be dog catcher. And Mr. Roosevelt, who wanted to be the president, understood there was no bluff here. So he did it. He passed the unemployment compensation and the Social Security and the minimum wage and the government hiring of people. He did what he was asked to do in the midst of a depression when there was no money in the hands of the government because unemployed people don't pay taxes. So where did the money come from? From the rich and the corporations. Roosevelt taxed them and said, what I don't tax from you, you're going to lend to me in the government so I can help the mass of people. That's right. Your money, you rich people, to help middle and low income people. The thing that politicians today want you to believe can't be done was done in the 1930s. You taxed the rich to help everybody else out. And what was the result for the politician who did it? Roosevelt? He was reelected to the presidency 3 times. In terms of elections, he's the most popular president in the history of the United States. Nobody else comes close. Turns out it's not only possible politically to do this sort of thing, it's the smartest thing you could have done, Mr. Obama. But he didn't. No one else did either. Okay, let's bring it to the present. After the war was over, 1945, the business community decided it had had enough. It was furious that it had been charged the taxes to pay for the New Deal. That was the name given to the Social Security and unemployment compensation and all that. They were furious that they had to lend government money to pay for all of that they were taxed to pay for all of that. That was not their idea about how private enterprise and free enterprise should work. They didn't want the government coming in there and doing these things on behalf of the majority. So they went to work to destroy the movement from below that they rightly understood was the power source of the New Deal. They did that. And they did it by hounding the communists first, weakest link in the New Deal chain, then going after the socialists, then going after the trade unions. So by the 60s, 50s, and 60s, they had wiped these institutions out. The left was hounded, discriminated against, demonized by the media, by the political monopoly of Republicans and Democrats, and even in the schools and in the universities. The Cold War descended like a horrific fog on the American mentality. Everything socialist and leftist was bad. Everything private capitalist was good. The world turned upside down because those who had to pay for the New Deal, which after all was a response to the failure of capitalism in the crash of '29, who cared about any of that? It had to be stopped. And it worked. And part of the reason that it worked was that World War II destroyed every competitor the United States had. The Soviet Union decimated. Germany, Britain, France, Japan decimated. At the end of the war, the United States, king of the hill. Other than Pearl Harbor, no bomb fell here. America didn't suffer. It came through the war, rebuilt, ready to roll. And it did. From 1945 to 1970, American capitalism recovered from the war, gave people jobs, gave people income. There was so much profit being made, you could afford to do that. And meanwhile, you destroyed the left. So far, capitalism in the catbird seat. But then the relentless nature of capitalism reasserts itself. By 1970, capitalists in the United States begin to realize we have accommodated our working class. And in the consequences of that, their wages are pretty high. Around the world, everybody else's wages are low by comparison. And that's helping our competitors. British, French, German, Belgian, Japanese, and then later on Chinese and Brazil, they all have lower wages and they're able to charge less for what they produce. And they're outcompeting us as a result. What are we going to do? And the American capitalists did what capitalists always do in these situations. They have to match the competitor, or even better, beat them at it. Well, how are they going to do that? Two ways. Number one, technology. Innovate, replace high-priced workers with machines. That gets you the computer and the robot and the artificial intelligence. Second part of the same strategy, move production from the United States, where wages are high, to anywhere else in the world where wages are low. China had some of the lowest wages in the world back then, 50 years ago, one of the poorest countries on the planet, welcoming anybody who would bring a job over there. And it worked. And American jobs began to disappear, either through automation or through export of the job. And the American working class was suddenly caught in the vice of capitalism. You know, from 1820 to 1970, American workers rode up the escalator of capitalism, never imagining that what goes up must come down. Capitalism has always done that. The places that were profitable are eventually abandoned for the other places. Detroit was once the center of a profitable American capitalism. It's now a very bad shadow of what it once was. Ditto for Cleveland, ditto for Youngstown, Ohio, ditto for Camden, New Jersey, ditto, ditto, ditto. Whole countries can experience that. That's what's happening to the United States. And so wages stopped rising after 1970. Oh, the money you got went up, but when you looked at the prices, they went up too. So your wage didn't go anywhere. American families that had assumed it would always go up discovered it didn't go up. If they wanted it to go up, if they wanted the American dream, the wife would have to go out to work if she hadn't before. The kids maybe, the elderly maybe. Everybody has to work. The family begins to fall apart. Even that isn't enough, and you have to do something you were taught as a child not to do. When you were little, you were supposed to save money and be thrifty. But as you grow into modern capitalism, the only way you can deliver to your family the American dream you promised them is if you borrow your way to oblivion. So that today American workers see their wages going nowhere, borrow to keep up. Borrow for your home, borrow for your car, borrow for your credit card, and the new one of the last 20 years, borrow to get your child a college education. And it's disappearing for the American worker, isn't it? The culture says the government shouldn't help you. Republicans, but also Democrats, hold back. Even in the pandemic we're living through. Trillions given to corporations by the Federal Reserve, but our leaders have to rub their chins. You can't spend too much to help those unemployed. Not 600 extra bucks a week, just 300. What? What? The majority we save on, and the rich minority. During the pandemic of the last 10 months, the richest Americans, 600 or so billionaires, have become much richer still, while 60 million Americans had to file for unemployment compensation for some or all of the last 10 months. I mean, this is a level of inequality that you have to go back to ancient Egypt and pharaohs to get something like this. And the American working class isn't stupid. It sees it all. It understands what it means that Jeffrey Bezos has a 600-foot yacht that is going to be the base for the moon rocket he is paying for to go and see what the moon looks like, while you are wondering about your job. The American people understand that they have been had, that what was promised to them is not being delivered. What they promised to their children will not be available to those children. It isn't now, and there's no prospect of that coming back. They understand that the monopoly in our politics, two parties that keep everybody out. This is a country that prides itself on not allowing monopolies in business, but allows those two parties to monopolize. And they do. And they're very rich, and they're paid for by the donors who are the big capitalists, as they always were. And so people understand they're not our politicians. These are not people who really work for us. They work for them, those that are getting richer while we aren't. And of course it makes people bitter and angry. Now, in their bitterness and anger, could they go left? Could they go right? Yeah, they could go either direction. But the left was destroyed after World War II. It hasn't been in the public discussions. It's not allowed in the university 99% of the time. It doesn't show up on television or in the newspapers. Meanwhile, the right wing, all over the place. So, of course, an angry working class, deceived, betrayed by the end of what they thought was built in, by a capitalism that has abandoned them for machines and other countries and could care less. They don't know where to turn. So when a politician sees that, an opportunistic politician, then it'll be tempting to ride that wave, to talk about that anger, to validate that anger, to say that all the other politicians are awful. I'm the only one. All the other forces in society are betraying you. I can and I will save you. And you might as well try me. I'm at least saying what you feel. The others pretend that there's no such feeling that has any validity at all. So yes, they voted for Mr. Trump in 2016. And no surprise either. Think about it. It's only surprising it didn't happen before. But now let's look at what did happen in these 4 years. What did Mr. Trump do? And the answer is sad. Just like the spectacle of those folks rampaging in the Capitol and not knowing what to do when they got in there is fundamentally, in my view, sad. Not just outrageous, but also sad. Here's what Mr. Trump did. 3 things. Number 1, he showed that he was a Republican, just like all the others. His first great act was the December 2017 tax cut for corporations and the rich. An immense tax cut. Let me drive home the remarkableness of that. Number one, it came at the end of a 40-year period during which income was lost by the middle and the bottom and redistributed to the top. Corporations had a better run between 1970 and 2017 than they had ever had in a comparable period of time in American history. The stock market rose like a rocket in the 80s and 90s and into the first part of this century. The last thing the wealthy and the corporations needed was a tax cut. They had been doing spectacularly. It was the mass of people whose wages hadn't gone up. It was the mass of people that were falling behind. They needed massive help they didn't get. The people who got massive help were the ones who didn't need it. Extraordinary. He gave the corporations a tax cut worth billions and billions. The second thing he did was to deregulate everything. That's basically what his cabinet appointments were there for. You're the head of education, you're the head of transportation, you're the head of Homeland Security, whatever it is, dismantle this government, free up enterprises to do all the things that regulations had stopped them from doing. A wonderful gift to business. Tax cut, deregulation. I told you there were three things. What was the third thing? The third thing was the follow-up of the first two. Because you were helping the people who didn't need it, and because you were not helping the people who did, whatever you said, you weren't changing their situation in a fundamental way. If you got people jobs, they were jobs at the low end of the pay scale. Yeah, better than no job at all, but no fundamental change in their inability to get that American dream that they had been told would be available to them if they worked hard. So you had a lot of anger building up. And the third thing Mr. Trump did was to manage that anger. How'd you do that? Political theater with some real ugly components. First, you deflected the anger of people at a system that had betrayed them. You deflected it onto poor Central American immigrants and their sad children. You spoke of an invasion. You spoke about them as if they were insects carrying a disease. You ignored their families. You ignored their minimum human needs. You conveniently forgot this is a country made up of immigrants. Unspeakable fascistic mentalities. And you also deflected anger onto others who were, like the immigrants, foreigners, always the sign of a cheap politician. Scapegoat the foreigner, the one who doesn't vote in your election, the one you can demonize at virtually no cost. So he demonized Mexico and Canada for cheating us. Then he demonized the Chinese for everything he could think of. Then he demonized the Europeans. They were also cheating us. This image of the United States as the victim of everybody else not playing fair, that's exactly what the working class felt. He could identify. You're being cheated, you American, like us or the Chinese are doing this. Brilliant. Give to the rich real wealth. Give to the poor scapegoats to hate. And treat them like they weren't quite human. Bitter. He did that. And that's why he was allowed to be the president and allowed to stay in the president's position. The corporations loved it. He delivered a better tax cut than previous Republicans had been able to do. Yeah, it was a little bit uncomfortable the way he treated those immigrants, but the big businesses were easily persuaded that deregulation plus tax cuts makes it all right. And so it was throughout the first 2, maybe even 3 years. But then the slow percolation of bitterness that wasn't going to the right. People who really suffered over the last 10, 20 years, even more. African Americans who lost the only property and wealth they had accumulated, their homes, in record numbers after 2008. Young people who were not discovering the jobs that they had borrowed money to go through college to get. And even if they got the few jobs, the income would never allow them to pay the debts back, let alone live a life. The young, the non-white, the victims began to discover the critics of capitalism and vice versa. And there begins to be that bubbling up of something on the left. I'm part of that. You are part of that. That's why we're talking to each other. And that made a problem. It was the beginning of a demonstration that Mr. Trump's behavior, good with the tax cut, good with the deregulation, good with the deflecting mass anger and bitterness away from capitalism, away from big business, and onto other scapegoats, this might now produce a blowback, a problem, a contradiction. The first inkling of it had happened before Trump was called Occupy Wall Street. The second sign of it was this remarkable event that Mr. Trump noticed in 2016, that there was a Bernie Sanders, and that when you said socialism, he didn't run away. He didn't deny. Yeah, I'm a socialist. Big deal. And it turned out, and it showed that even more in 2020, that millions and millions of Americans were angry enough about what they could see and feel and experience about capitalism that socialism looked pretty interesting, worth an investigation, not to be dismissed out of hand. Uh-oh. To the American business community, this meant, we may be coming to the end of our use for Mr. Trump. He may have outlived his usefulness. After all, we have gotten from him the tax cut we want, the deregulation we want, the scapegoating we benefit from. And maybe now, if he's beginning to produce a backlash, we had better shift sides, be friendly to the backlash, so when the Democrats come in to replace Mr. Trump, we will be their friends, and we will get from them maybe not all we got from Mr. Trump, but most of it. And he won't be able, or we will persuade him not, to undo much of what Mr. Trump did, just enough to keep his own people happy. And by the way, if Mr. Biden can't keep the lid on the situation, we will go right back to Trump #2 if we need to. Because after all, that's what we did when we brought him in and when we let him stay there. That's where the United States is. And the frustration that you saw on January 6th has been building for 40 years. It's a frustration of people who know their situation is being sold down the river. There are no good jobs for them. There is no recovery for them. They're bitter and angry. That's why they do the kinds of irrational things that overly bitter and angry people do. They've been told so many things that didn't turn out right, that turned out to be ways for someone to make more money, that when the government says, come put a mask on, they've had it. It's that last straw. They won't do it. It's exactly the same as saying, I've had it with the government telling me what to do. When I drive my car through an intersection, I'm not going to be told when I can drive with a green light and when I can't with a red light. The effort to explain to them that's the only way we're all going to get through intersections alive, it's not that they don't understand it. Of course they do. They always have. But they are at a boiling point. Not wearing a mask is craziness. Climbing up the Capitol's wall, that's craziness too. But it would be a terrible mistake to give it some abstract theoretical explanation without understanding its roots in genuine, real, lived experience. That's what makes those people think and act the way they do. And if that isn't changed, they will continue, and their neighbors will, and their children will. Here's the real punchline, the conclusion to draw from everything I've tried to say. The Biden administration coming in has got to make fundamental structural changes in the United States. Otherwise, what has been going on for 40 years will continue to go on. How do I know? Because of what's happened. We have become a more unequal society every year for 40 years. Uninterrupted. Republicans, Democrats made no difference. Oh, the pace was faster now, slower then. But the pace is no longer the issue. It's the reality of where we are. You can't have another little policy over here, an adjustment of the taxes. We're beyond that. I can tell you in advance, too little, too late. No matter what you do, you have to change the basis of this society. Why? Because if you don't, if we take seriously what the Biden administration tells us, both in its words and in the names and the natures of the people it has appointed to the highest offices, they are people who want to, in their words, go back to the pre-Trump normal. The pre-Trump normal is how we got to Trump. And if you go back to that, you are creating the process that will deliver to us the next Trump. Whether his name is Cruz or Hawley or Trump or Pence really doesn't matter. You can't do that. That's a policy that makes no sense. But when I say basic changes, here's what I mean. You've got to do something now to alter and end the absurd and obscene inequality in this society. That's not going to be done by marginal tax rate changes or giving everybody $2,000 or any of that. You have to change the system. We now have a system in which the distribution of wealth and income is determined by the employers. They're the ones who dispose of the discretionary money in this society, the profits. They pay their workers as little as they can get away with. They accumulate the profits, and then they distribute the profits to the shareholders as dividends, to the top executives as pay packages. You know the story. As long as we allow a rich minority to decide how to distribute the discretionary wealth, they will end up and continue to do what they've been doing, which is giving it to themselves. And if you want a different distribution, you've got to make a different distributional system. Here's how you do it. You democratize the enterprise. It's a democratic decision how you distribute. Will then the democratic decision of all the workers, one worker, one vote, decide to give a tiny number of people vast amounts of money while everybody else cannot afford to send their kid to college? Will not happen. Never has, will not now. That's a fundamental change. That every worker will understand. That will be tangible right away in the redistribution of the product and of the wealth. That will show that we now have a government that is fundamentally different. Not the same old Republicans and Democrats. And not the opportunist Trump who rides dissension into office, makes it pay for himself, leaves in a burst of vainglorious theater, only to have the society lapse back. That is a disaster. Let me conclude with a historical parallel that may teach the same point. The German working class, about the same time that the American working class experienced wonderful growth after the Civil War in this country and after the unification that produced Germany around the same time in Europe. From roughly 1870s into the First World War in 1914, German economy boomed. Workers' standard of living rose. But then the working class of Germany, which thought it was an ascendant working class, was subject to three terrific blows imposed on the working class by its elite political and economic leaders. First was the declaration of World War I, which the Germans lost. Terrible blow, end of the Kaiser, end of Imperial Germany, unspeakable. 3 years later, they had one of the worst inflations in human history. At the end of 1919, the war now over, one US dollar was worth about 45 German marks. 3 years later, the end of 1922, $1 was worth 7,000 German marks. And a year after that, late in 1923, $1 was worth, ready, 4 trillion German marks. Prices were doubling every hour at your neighborhood store. The savings accumulated by German families from the 1870s to 1920, that were their bedrock, that were their security blanket, that money slowly accumulated over the years was in a matter of months made worthless. 50 years of savings bought you a quarter pound of butter. The blow to the German middle class greater than what World War I's defeat meant. And then, in some ways the worst of all, the 1929 Great Depression hit Germany. 3 blows, a lost war, an inflation, and a Great Depression. It drove the German working class crazy. Half of them became radical socialists and communists. And the other half became another kind of socialist, because the Trump types in Germany knew they had to call whatever they did socialist if working people would give them any attention at all. So they came up with an interesting gambit. They were national socialists to distinguish them from the very old and well-established Socialist Party, which were their enemies, and the Communist Party, which were their enemies. N-A-Z-I are the first 4 letters of the word national in German. That's why they're Nazis. And they went to the capitalists and said, you know, you're a minority. You don't have any mass support. You don't have a mass base. The communists and the socialists are saying, you're the cause of the problem. You declared war. You manufactured the inflation, and you are presiding over the crash of capitalism, your system. They're against you, and they're going to win unless you get a mass base in a hurry. And the only available mass base for you is us, the organized Nazi political party. And in January of 1933, the president of Germany, following their rules and constitution, invited Adolf Hitler to form a government, because the business community had sent him a letter saying, we have to choose between these two, and we choose the National Socialists, not those socialists and communists who are critical of capitalism. And that brought in Mr. Hitler, who proceeded to destroy the socialists, the communists, and the unions, literally and figuratively. And the rest is history. Back in 1923, Hitler was in a rush. He thought he could accelerate and rush the process. So he and a bunch of young white men, looking an awful lot like those who took over the Capitol on January 6th in D.C. They took over a building in downtown Munich, Bavaria, as the first step in what was planned to be a takeover of the entire German government. Things didn't work out. The police and the military arrived. Hitler was arrested. He was tried. He was found guilty, and he was put in jail. And he spent the next almost a year in jail before he was let out. He learned something. He learned that this kind of a attack on a building full of big noise, and that was not the way to succeed. That was the way to land in jail. You have to organize a political party, a social movement, until you're big enough that they have to deal with you, that they don't dare bother you, arrest you, imprison you, or anything else. In 1923, no one ever heard of him. He was sitting in a jail in Munich. 10 years later, in 1933, he had done the organization. Why? Because the capitalist system of Germany only got worse in the intervening 10 years. Liberals, socialists, and others frittered around the edges. They didn't make basic changes. So Hitler's base, what he had started with, it only got larger. The suffering of the mass of Germans only got deeper. And then the Depression hit. I tell you this story not because Hitler and Trump are the same. They're not. The point is not that they're identical. The point is that there is a lesson. If you don't make the basic changes that are causing these social divisions and crises, they will get worse. If Mr. Biden chooses to continue to be the kind of central Democrat, middle of the road, spokesman for the corporations that have been the dominating force in his home state of Delaware his entire life, then he will be recreating the conditions, presiding over the deepening of the conditions that produced both Mr. Trump and those disastrous events at the Capitol. Only the next time, those folks who cheered that on will very likely have learned better ways to go about the same tasks aimed at the same objective. The United States is at a crossroads, at a tipping point. But unfortunately, most of the people, even those shocked by the events of January 6th, practice denial more than they practice confronting what the issues are, what the history has been that brought us to this point. A last comment. Much of the commentary in the United States about the events at the Capitol in Washington on January 6th speak in terms of how that was a threat to American democracy. You hear it all the time. Well, that's an example of what I mean by denial. What in the world does American democracy mean? We have two political parties that operate a total monopoly. No other party can function under the rules imposed by that monopoly. What democracy are you talking about? In the workplaces of America, the factories, the offices, the stores, what is the system that governs the workplace? The place where humans in America spend most of their adult lives. 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of those 5 days are at the workplace. Workplaces are not only not democratically organized, they are the antithesis of democracy. In your workplace, your boss, the employer, tells you what to do, tells you how to do it, tells you where to do it, tells you what the raw materials are, tells you what machines you will use, and at the end of the day, you leave behind what you've used your brains and muscles to produce because it belongs instantaneously to the employer, not to you. If you don't like this, the employer can fire you, take your job, take your income, plunge you and your family, your community into whatever difficulty that means. What power have you got over the employer? Nothing. The employer is not accountable to you. You don't vote for him or her. It's no democracy. If you believed in democracy, you would have installed it in the workplace long ago. Instead, democracy has been excluded from the workplace. You have elections, but to them, to the two-party system in which the between the parties becomes more difficult over time to discern. And on the basic questions, there are no differences. That's why they all vote for the defense budget, as I pointed out earlier. This is not a democracy. It hasn't been. That's a task. That's a project. And it would be a good response to the attack that we had on January 6th. But I would not be honest with you unless I told you that the Biden administration at this point has not shown any sign that it is willing to consider, let alone implement, the kinds of structural changes I've been talking about. The only thing that can make that happen would be a groundswell, like in the 1930s, from below. Working people in unions, in socialist organizations, in social movements, organized, banding together, coalescing into a force that cannot be denied. Could that happen in the United States? Yes. Is it going in that direction? Yes. Will it happen soon enough? No one knows. But that is the key question determining what the consequences of these tumultuous weeks will be, both for the United States and the rest of the world. This is Richard Wolf for Democracy at Work. Thank you very much for listening and watching, and I look forward to you when we meet again 2 months from now. Thank you and good night.